that moment where you're like, I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
And I know I'm not crazy. Like, I can absolutely trust myself.
Welcome to the Happiness and Progress podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I'm an Emmy award-winning journalist, an international speaker, a mom, wife, and you know what I like to say, just a person looking for more joy in the everyday. This is a space where you belong, not because you earned it, not because of your title, your paycheck, or number of kids you have, but just because you are human and you are good. Here we explore progress over perfection, emotional and spiritual wellness, and how to relish the good parts of life that coexist with the not so good parts. This is Happiness in Progress. Hello, I'm so glad you're here today. And today I have a special treat for you. But before I introduce our guest, I want to remind you that there is now a companion podcast workbook for you available. Patreon subscribers every single month will get a workbook that takes them through all of the interviews. It gives you the opportunity to write notes, do some journaling with prompts specific to the episode, as well as a couple of activities for each episode. You can find the link to become a Patreon subscriber in show notes. Okay, you ready for the good stuff? Who's ready for the good stuff? Let's get to it. I want to introduce you to Arielle Estoria. She is a poet, actor, model, and author. She has shared her work through spoken word pieces, workshops, and keynote talks with companies you might have heard of like Google, Lululemon, Tedx, the SKIMS campaign by Kim Kardashian, and much more. You may recognize her from her commercials with brands like Etsy, Starbucks, PayPal, and TJ Maxx. She is the author of the new book, just an incredible book. I really enjoyed reading it, The Unfolding. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. We talk about so much good stuff in this episode. First of all, how to trust yourself. I know it's hard. I feel it. We're also going to talk about how to hear your own voice and distinguish it from others' voices, and how to live authentically over living for approval. That's a tough one. And the steps to returning home to yourself. That and a whole lot more. So let's get to it. Hi, Arielle. Thank you so much for making time to be on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited to talk with you because your work is so beautiful. It just hits the soul. I mean, really, you did just a fantastic job with this book.
Thank you.
So I just want to start with, was there a moment that you kind of realized, I'm not at home with myself right now?
Mm-hmm.
Things are misaligned.
Yeah, I think there was definitely, I always say, like, usually when people ask, how are you so confident, or how did this show up for you? It's often because I'd lived in a deficit of those things. So I had spent a long time knowing and discerning and being an intuitive to when I wasn't in my body, when I wasn't tapped in, when I wasn't connected, when I wasn't grounded. So it now becomes very obvious and very evident when I'm not operating out of my my fullness and my full identity. And so specifically in the context of The Unfolding, I think there was just a season where I couldn't trust myself. I couldn't trust my partner. I couldn't trust the decisions I was making. There was just so many things that were coming up, and I was just like, I don't know where I stand. I don't know where my feet are. I don't know if my head is above water or under it. It was just this very strong awareness of like, I am not where my feet are, is kind of what I say in terms of being grounded, in terms of being connected. So there wasn't a one thing. I think it was just a collective season of just, I'm all over the place, like I tend to feel that way, but it was even more so just this really disorienting season of just, I don't trust myself, and that's a really scary thing when I've really tried to do the work to get to the point where I could trust myself.
Mm-hmm. This was after doing the work to trust yourself?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that is really scary.
Yeah.
Because you feel the misalignment even more.
Yes.
I think a lot of people can identify with what you just said. So what is the first step? How do you get back to you?
Yeah, I think there has to be a lot of shedding. A lot of my journey of the unfolding had to do with spirituality and faith. And so I had to undo a lot of what it wasn't in order to decide what it was. And that first meant is this the voice of the divine, of a universe, of a creator, or is this an authority figure? Is this the conditioning I've been given? Is this, people who have been put in charge of how I operate? Is this their voice, or is this a voice that's bigger and orchestrating? And so my first, breakdown became from whose voice is this? And then you add the element of like, is this my voice, or is this the
Yeah.
voice in my head that shoulds on myself all the time? Whose voice is this? What voice is leading me, and is it the voice I thought was in the first place? And so I think a lot of that work came from that differentiation, is whose voice is this, and asking that question. And then it got to the point where I was like, that's not my voice, or that's not the voice of what I feel is holy and orchestrating. And so it really came down to identifying what those leading voices were, and who they belonged to.
And when you realized, okay, that's not my voice, what
Hmm.
was that feeling? Was it like
Yeah.
freedom, or like maybe
Well,
a
it's a
little
little
fear, or like,
disorienting. Yeah,
yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of fear, a little disorienting at first, because you're like, okay, well then whose voice is
yeah, like
whose
whose
voice
voice have
is
I been
this?
listening to?
Whose voice has been really like guiding, and I'm a people pleaser, and I know that about myself through and through. I'm the oldest child. I'm a
We're a certain
pastor's
way,
kid.
these
Yeah,
oldest.
we're just a certain way. So I won't ever ignore that I am a people pleaser. So I realized how at that point how much of my life, whether I was intuitively doing it or not, was based off wanting to please people
Mm.
and wanting to seem, approved of, and the good girl, and the righteous girl, and the whatever guidelines we put on ourselves. And so I got to the point where I was like, oh, I'm trying to make a decision that's not being applauded for, or that is, creating tension, that it's wrong, when it feels every bit of right in my soul and in my heart. So what is it really? And how much of my life? And I had a mentor who, asked me, she was like, could you live a life that's based off of what you want, and not the life, that's going to give you an applause or approval of other people, which is terrifying, because that ultimately means we're relinquishing some spaces of belonging and connectedness. And we don't want that. That's terrifying. But is it worth being half of ourselves or being less of ourselves in order to fit into that conditioned type of belonging?
Wow, that is such a huge aha moment.
Mhm.
So you said your friend asked you that question. What was your answer?
Yeah.
How did you move forward?
Um, I don't think I answered her in a moment. I
You're like,
definitely just
actually,
was
I'm gonna
like,
need to think about that.
huh, okay, noted. Because you have those moments where you don't realize, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that until I'm speaking all of this out loud. And I know the choice I want to make. I know the direction I want to go. And what's keeping me from doing that? The opinion of other people, like
Mm,
heavy opinion of
mm,
other people. And so I just sat with your question for a long time. I don't think I
mhm.
just was like, probably like, huh, in the
Yeah,
moment, and just
yeah.
kind of left it at that.
Right. So this is all the awakening, right? In your book, you
Hmm.
separate the unfolding in several
Yeah,
sections. It starts with the awakening. Can I read one of your poems?
absolutely. I would love
Okay.
that.
I feel like I'm pretty good at reading words, but poems I'm a little nervous. So if I,
I love
if I
it.
mess
You're
up
gonna do
the
great.
if I mess up the up and the down and that AP English iambic
You got it.
pentameter, it's in my head. Okay, this is called Waking. It said, it says, who told you that the lioness in your chest was distraction when she has always been a reminder? Who told you that the roar was a hum, a sound to be ignored? Who told you to deny your beckoning? Who whispered that your purpose was a misstep? Assumed the path your feet paved was confusion of direction and not trailblazing? Keep
Mm.
winding, keep listening. This is no episode of bewilderment. You are not confused. You are the most sane you have ever been, and this moment right here is the most awake you have ever felt. I get goosebumps. Oh my gosh. What was the experience behind this poem? What went into this poem?
Mhm. I think, I mean, most of the poems that you find in there are poems that I needed to speak and to reconcile with for myself. Either they're poems that I needed to literally speak over myself, like this is not my fear, this is not my anxiety, this is not my fear, this is not my anxiety. I
Yeah, I love that
literally
one.
had to like declare things over myself in order to like bring me back to this groundedness. So that poem was this like it was this coming to, if you will, this reality of like I've been told a lot of things, which is why it's called why it's called, I think it's Who Told You,
Waking.
or Waking. It used to be Who Told You. I think it's Who Told You on Spotify. So you can find it as a different title there. Um but yeah, it is the coming to, which is why it's called the waking. It is the reality of like, oh, no, it's that moment where you're like, I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
And I know I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
Like, I can absolutely trust myself. I refuse to listen to things that have been used to keep me from understanding myself, that keep me from knowing myself. And so it was really that declaration poem for me. Like, I'm awake. I am fully awake and I'm fully in tune with what it is I'm experiencing, what it is I want, and who it is I'm going and trying and being at the same time. And so that poem was like I write a lot of poems that I'm like I need to put it down on paper so that it can kind of look back at me. And that poem kind of was the poem that looked back at me, and I after writing it was like, yeah,
I love
I'm awake.
I love
Mhm.
this idea of writing these poems over you, speaking this truth to you and
Mhm.
having to revisit it. Because I think
Yes.
anytime we're trying to come back to ourselves, get back on the
Mhm.
path that makes sense to us, or stop
Mhm.
listening to all the voices, these are hard changes. And so I think
Absolutely.
it is okay to understand that we're going to get a little confused and be like, wait, this is confusing. What's
Right.
happening? And then to have something
Right.
like this, like, let me speak this over myself over and over
Mhm.
again. I think that's
Mhm.
grounding. And I think that's also a powerful reminder that it's okay that this is hard.
Yeah,
It's
and
okay. It's
it's
a
gonna
process.
be hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
be so soft and be so gentle with yourself because I definitely say the waking it's a disorienting coming to. It is an afternoon nap and you're like, "What year is it? Who am I? Where am I? What time is it? Is it the same day or a different day?" It is so discombobulating. So allow yourself to be in that moment and to like it's that shifting around in the darkness, like where, okay, this is here. It's so disorienting. So be very gracious with yourself. Unfortunately, it is something that has to happen. So we can't run from it, but we can have grace with ourselves in the process.
Mhm, mhm, and then look up these words on Spotify to listen to over and over again.
Yes.
Guide you through the confusion. Okay, so, the second phase of the book, the second section is the eclipsing. This is the dark part. I
Mhm,
identify a lot with
mhm.
this, so explain to me a little bit about what this is.
Yeah, the eclipsing is like I said, it's that fumbling around in the dark. I was sharing with someone yesterday. I feel like the awakening is a very internal experience, and the eclipsing is a very external one.
Mm,
I think oftentimes in that waking too, there are other elements that come in and make it even more so confusing and disorienting. Especially if you're just not waking up and someone else is like, okay, we gotta go, you gotta get dressed, you're like, oh, what is I hate what I'm wearing. It's just like
mhm.
I need to fix up. And so I feel like the eclipsing is a very external space. While I was dealing with these coming to moments, these waking to moments, there was so much I was met with of like, this is not who you're supposed to be. This is not the path. This is not the direction. And so that made the eclipsing as shadowy and as disorienting as it was because there were so many other elements that were then being added to the mix. And that you ultimately in that eclipsing space is that shadow space. It's this moment where the person we were and the person we are and are becoming kind of like intersect a little bit. And it comes to the point of like, okay, which one who are we going to be? Like, are
Mhm.
we going to keep fitting in to these boxes? Are we going to keep fitting into these spaces that is much too small for the expansiveness of our wingspan? Or are we going to allow ourselves to unfold?
The expansiveness of our wingspan. Oh my goodness, I love that. So
Mhm.
I experienced that total eclipse we had here across the US like 5
Yeah.
years ago. And it was interesting because as the moon starts moving in front of the sun, everything starts getting dark
Yep.
and like animals start coming out. Like suddenly we're like hearing
Yeah.
a coyote, we're hearing chirping and like the frogs. Like, it was
Wow.
very obvious how
Wow.
confused everyone
Right.
was. They're like, "Wait,
Right.
is it time to
What
start
time is it? Yeah,
is
yeah,
it
yeah.
time to start chirping and making night noises?" So I so I loved that description. I loved the naming of this as the
Yeah.
eclipsing because like you said, it is so confusing.
Yeah.
Um, I can often get caught in this wishing or missing the old me before the awakening. And so
Mm.
how can I or other people dealing with that, when that thought creeps in, accept it as growth and accept it as change and moving forward to a
Yeah.
whole us?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to leave room for a lot of grief.
Yeah.
A lot of grief because there is a longing, there is a missing who we were, um, because and only I think it's solely because of how uncomfortable becoming is truly is, so what we're really longing for is that safety and is that familiarity that we knew things then.
Mm,
We knew ourselves then. We knew what was comfortable, what was uncomfortable, but at the same time, how much of that knowing was in a conditioned space. So, how much of it was actually ours, and how much of it was actually how we were shaped? So I think there's a lot of grief that comes in that play because you're like, ah, it was so warm there. It was so familiar. I knew and I didn't know all at the same time, but I didn't know that I didn't know. And that's really what it comes down to is once you see, you can't unsee, right? Once you wake up, you can go back to sleep, but you're not going to go back to sleep the same way, and
mhm.
you're not going to wake up the same. And so acknowledge that there is a lot of grief that you will miss, the person that you were, that you will, grieve that naivete,
Mhm.
that you once had. And I think that's fair. But I think what it really comes down to is what you're missing. Was that a full version of you? Or was that a piece of
Ooh.
you? Was that a sliver of you that you thought in that moment was the fullest version until you came to the ways that you have not been living as full and as whole. And I think that's really where the grief comes in. Is like, yeah, I miss who I was.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that that person's not still part of us. I think I have a quote in the book, that says it's like one of the standalone graphics that like give flowers to all the past versions of you, for they are now the soil in which you bloom. They're still a part of you. They're still who you are. They're still a part of this, but it's adding to the fullness. That was a version of you. Now this is this version of you. I heard in another podcast where a fellow author and speaker, someone came up to him and mentioned something, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that was so 9 me ago. That was so
9
13
me's
me's
ago.
ago." That was so like 13 me's ago. Like, oh, what a time! And I just like really loved that solidarity of like, yeah, that was a version of me. That was about 4 or 5 Arielles ago. That was about 6, 7 Arielles ago. And I think allowing that space and that permission for us to be those, have been those versions. And now we are the version we are
That's
standing
real
here
that's
today.
really beautiful because I think a lot of times, like, I'll think of, like, past women whose shoulders I stand on who allow me
Yeah.
to do the things I can do today, but
Right.
even past me's allow me to do the things that I can do today.
Absolutely. Like you
That's
think about the things you've experienced and how the first time around it's disorienting, it's startling, but then you do it again or it happens again or a situation comes up again. You're like, okay, I got this a little bit more. I've been here before, I'm familiar. It's that continuous buildup of you start to bring things under your belt as you go along life and getting a little bit more assertive, getting a little bit more aware of yourself, getting a little bit more free as you go about. And I think that's what growth is that we take these lessons, we take these things we didn't do, and now we know better. And now we
Mm-hmm.
do better, as we
Mm-hmm.
move forward.
Mm-hmm. How can we turn that growth into wholeness?
Mm. I think the growth blooms into wholeness regardless. I think just the sheer act of being willing, I'm gonna be uncomfortable here. Like I'm a plant mom. I became a plant mom in the pandemic. Now that life is a little bit more full and busy, I don't regret it. But there's a lot of plants to water. So, but they teach me a lot, especially the process of having to repot a plant, and you repot a plant because the roots start to be too big for what's holding it. And all of my plants I mostly keep in their grow pot, which is that little plastic thing that you usually buy it in. And I keep progressing it to bigger grow pots. It's easier to water and all of that. But when it starts to become too big for that space, because the roots are starting to fall out, the leaves aren't growing as full and as beautifully as they can. And I think the same goes for us as humans. We can continuously put ourselves in spaces where our roots have been grown out. We are stunting our growth because we're choosing to stay where it's safe, where it's comfortable, where it's familiar, where it's small. And so I think we know when we're willing to grow out of that, because it's just too dang uncomfortable. It gets to the point where you're like, I need a bigger pot. Like, I cannot grow here. I cannot expand here. And that could be, changing perspectives, changing beliefs, and it's scary to change the pot. And my plants are drama. So leaves fall out and everything. And it takes a moment. I keep talking to them, keep watering. I'm like, I know it's new. I know it's a home and you're not familiar, but I promise this is going to be the best thing for you. And I feel like I just need to extend that to myself and to others sometimes too.
Yeah, yeah, I can be a little bit of drama as well. And
Absolutely.
I
Same.
I think talking to myself when I'm in the drama, like, I know it's hard, and
Hmm.
offering that same compassion to myself, I think,
Yes.
is would be really beneficial.
Yes.
Okay, so we started talking about sections, so I kind of want to go through some of the other sections as well. So you
Hmm.
have illuminating next. Tell me about what that
Yeah.
is.
The illuminating is the shedding light after all this darkness. You get to
Mm,
the point where you're like, okay, I've shed a lot. I've peeled back a lot of layers. I've woken up to some realities that I think I've been suppressing, that I think I've been, not acknowledging. And so the illuminating comes to the point where you're like, okay, there's a little light here. I'm gonna dance in this for a moment. I'm allow this to be a relief. And then I'm gonna come to terms with like, okay, what am I taking with me as I keep moving forward? Which is why the illuminating gets into the mending space, is because we then bring light, we shed light to this is who I was. And I don't think I want to bring that with me anymore. But this is also a part of who I was. And I'm definitely bringing that still into, because I think as we shift and change, and the whole point of the unfolding is that there's still this bulb, there's still this core aspects of who we are and how we are that I don't think really shift and change as much, but it's those outside layers, those
mhm,
outside petals that we fold back as that center still stays really true. So the illuminating is kind of shedding light to, okay, what have I shed and what's still there and what is ultimately pulsing at the core of who I am.
mhm.
And there's still some grievance that happens because once we bring things to the light, we're like, okay, didn't know that about myself, or I did not know I was bringing that with me, So there's still a level of grief, or disoriented because you're shedding light on things that maybe you've been really hiding, really pushing the
Mhm.
skeletons in the closet, and so now we're shedding light. So we're bringing light to all those things, but it becomes in the light becomes the sifting, and that's what takes us into the mending space.
Mhm. And then the mending space, this is the healing part of the journey, yes?
Hmm.
So tell me about what
Yeah.
this looked like for you. You had this
Yeah.
awakening. It was scary. It was dark at times. What does healing look like?
Yeah, the mending for me, I think a visual example of it was I had visited Tel Aviv, Israel, Tel Aviv in Israel, which is the capital, I believe. And it was the most stunning place I think I've ever been. And we stayed at a hotel on the beach, and something told me to just like put my stuff down and go outside. So I put my stuff down. I went outside and I'm like walking this path with these giant rocks just surrounded by ocean. And it is just captivating and stunning. And I'm listening to music, and the rocks are there, the waves are crashing against the rocks, and I'm being splashed, and it's just like this really ethereal, really a cathartic space. And all of a sudden I can't tell if I'm crying or if it's water being splashed on me. And I think the mending, that healing space feels a lot like that. It's this wave, this washing over, this clarity. And I think in that moment it was like, where I really came to terms with like, no, I know who I am. I know the decisions I'm making. I have brought myself this far in life. At that point, I'm like, not quite. I'm like, probably, this was around 29. I think I'm 29 at this point. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, no, I can trust myself. I do know who I am. And as I'm shifting and changing, it is good. Like I was being met with like, it's not positive, the person you're
Mhm.
becoming. It's not becoming, the person you're becoming. When it felt so right. It felt so purposeful. It felt so orchestrated. And so that's what I think of that mending space is the waves are crashing, and it's just that sigh of relief, that reminder of yes, I do know who I am. Yes, I do know what I want. And it's okay for me to know those things. And it's good for me to know those things. And then also talking about the art of kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of taking these pieces, and of clay or of glass and molding them together with this gold glue, if you will. I actually had them on my nails a little bit, like this
Oh, I love it.
gold kind of element to remind me of how we mend these pieces. And when you build it back together, you still see where it was broken. You still see where it was shattered, but it's still whole and it's still beautiful. And so the mending space is a lot about that. It's a lot about what pieces am I taking with me, and how am I contributing that to the wholeness and the freedom that I exist in right now.
Hmm. And to know that that was your voice.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the last section, I want to make sure we get to them all, is returning. And even just what we were talking about here, that feels like that pivotal moment of
Absolutely.
this is me, and I've returned to
Yeah.
that solid ground.
Yeah, it's I think it's in this section. There's a poem that I end with there I am and there I've always been. Um like, oh, there she is. It's that moment when you like, I don't know about anyone else, but I feel like when I'm on my cycle, that's a whole different person. She probably has a whole different name. I don't know. She's probably like Azrael. I don't know who she is or
This
where
is the
she is,
evil
but it's
twin.
this, yeah. And then once you're past it, you're like, who was I? I think that is honestly what the returning feels like. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh God. I was like voice memoing a friend, and she was asking me like how I am. And I was like, oh, I can't answer that question subjectively because I'm on my period. Maybe talk to me next week because I don't know who I am right now, and that happens every month. Like that's really freaking wild. And then we're past it, and you're like, oh God, I'm back. Thank God.
Yeah.
I really
Right.
thought I lost you.
I am so glad you said that because I'll go through, I've done so much inner work, and
Uh-huh.
I'll be like, and so much mindset work, and I'll be like having the greatest month ever. And then like
Yes.
3 days, I'm like, wow, I'm a total piece
Uh,
of crap. What's the point of my
right.
life? I can't even believe I'm here. And then, and then 3 days later, I'm like, ah, here I
Oh,
am.
I'm back. Oh, thank God. It is really, and I don't know if it gets progressively worse the older you get. I'm like, I don't think I was really having those experiences like in high school and college. But now as I'm like approaching like early to mid 30s, I'm like, oh, this is some other kind of stuff
Yeah, I
because
wonder if it's just
I
because we're
legitimately disappear for 5, 6 days out of the month.
I
Literally.
I wonder if we're just more aware because we've done all of this work, and so now it's
Truly.
so obvious with when we're misaligned.
Yes, goodness. My goodness. I'm like, oh, if this gets progressive, I don't know. That's its own part of coming back to yourself. That's its own
That's
work.
that's really funny. I'll get into one of these things and my husband will be like, you
Mm,
know what? Just wait 3 days and then make a decision. Wait 3 days and then we'll
yes.
revisit this topic.
I'm already a very indecisive person in general. Don't ask me on my cycle. Don't ask me because I'm either really gonna know or I'm really not gonna know. That's the only way it's gonna
Yeah,
go.
and I do feel like when I really do know, it's not the same decision I would make in a week. So
Mm-mm,
that's okay.
mm-mm.
It's okay.
Definitely not.
We could probably do a full podcast episode on that.
Absolutely.
I like to end by asking each of my guests one tip from finding more joy in the good, the bad, and the in between.
I think it's just remembering that joy is still in the good, the bad, and the in between. I talk about, the concept of improv. There's a yes and exercise. It's where yes, and so when your partner says like, "Oh my gosh, there's a satellite falling from the sky," you can't say, "No, you're insane." You have to say, "Yes, and I think there are aliens on it." Like let's go have dinner with them. It has to continue. And so I think the idea of joy, we've associated that it's not in those other places, but it's yes and the grief is there, the in between is there, the bad is there, and even that phrasing, it's all way more intertwined than we think. So know that you can hold both, know that both exist, and know that in each of those spaces, they're seasonal. They do not last forever. They are moments in a droplet of infinite time. And to be present in it all when it occurs and when it comes up.
That is such a beautiful answer. Thank you so much for spending your time
Thank
with me today.
you.
And thank you for this beautiful book. I mean, truly
Thank you. Thank you.
I love it when I read a body of work that I can just see how big the impact can be in an
Mm,
individual's soul and their life. So really, really
thank
fantastic
you.
job.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I absolutely love talking to Arielle. What a treat. And I loved her book. You can find the link to buy it in show notes. You can also find the link to subscribe to Happiness in Progress on Patreon. When you do that, you will get a May 2023 workbook. Every single month, there's a new workbook that coincides with what you're learning here in the interviews and on these episodes of Happiness in Progress. You can find that in show notes. And I want to thank you for being here on Happiness in Progress.